Hi, my name is Alice, and I wrote a thesis about asexual experiences of being medicalized and how they relate to the concept of compulsory sexuality.
I spent a day in southern Sweden, in Malmö, where I met up with Alice, who I asked to talk about her bachelor thesis.
My name is Alice, I am 26 years old, my pronouns are she, her, and I am ace. I was studying social psychology at the university. We were asked to do sort of a pilot study. I just got this idea that it would be interesting to interview someone or some people who were ace from my ace community about experiences of aphobia. So I did that. In this pilot study, I found quite early on that a big part of the aphobia that they were experiencing were about what I would say being medicalized. So coming from the pilot study, I found that there was a huge research gap concerning asexuality in scientific literature. And so I thought, it would be great if someone did something about this. And I sort of thought that, but I couldn't, and realized that I actually can.
So she started her research by finding people to interview.
As an in-group member of the asexual community and a specific online ace community, I had access to an online ace community, and that was where I searched for interviewees. It's international, this ace community, so I live in Sweden, but the interviewees are from all over sort of the West. I ended up getting 5 interviewees, which I then asked to prepare 3 examples of where they had experienced being medicalized, or where they had been confronted with asexuality, being medicalized. And these experiences could be retrieved from sort of personal experience, where they would be confronted with someone medicalizing them, but it could also be experiences from social media or literature, movies, etc.
And this is what medicalization means.
Medicalization, then, describes a process by which non-medical problems become defined and treated as medical problems, usually in terms of illness and/or disorders. So asexuality in my thesis, then, is something that is seen as being defined to then become treated as an illness or a disorder.
And Alice did find some interesting things during her interviews.
Quite early on in the process, even before I was done with all the interviewees, I found certain themes. And that is sort of what I'm supposed to find, so grateful for that. The first big find was that all these experiences of being medicalized or being faced with aphobia in some manner could be divided into 2 categories: being invalidated and/or having to explain or deliver cause. So your asexuality in some manner had to be explained, or there had to be a cause for you to be asexual, or it was invalidated in some manner. So the invalidation then could be divided into 3 subgroups, sort of. The first one being that asexuality as a valid sexual orientation was invalidated. It's not an orientation. Asexuality could also be accepted as existing, but not as a orientation. It's something else. Perhaps there is something called asexuality, but it's not a valid orientation. It's not orientation at all. And the third one being that asexuality might exist, it might be an orientation, it might not be, but no matter what, you're not asexual. So your legitimacy to your orientation is not validated.
And the other category that she mentioned was having to find an explanation for your asexuality.
The demand for your asexuality to have a cause, sort of, could very easily be divided into either a mental cause or a somatic, a bodily cause. The somatic causes that my interviewee shared with me were quite horrible, frankly. I had one interviewee who had been to a certified LGBTQ therapist who asked if perhaps their asexuality had been inherited. Is this something that runs in your family? A very clear example of asexuality being caused by something bodily. It is not an orientation that you're born with, it's caused by something. And there are many more examples of this, sort of like the thought of asexuality being a cause from castration was something that surfaced. a result of a lack or a deficient libido. A very common thing that you face as an asexual person is this idea that you're deficient in your hormonal levels. Also a very clear example of a bodily cause. It could also be seen as a result of being treated for depression with medication such as SSRI. The mental causes then were often seen to come from trauma of some sort. It could be something that happened to you in your childhood, it could be sexual trauma, that then would explain why you are asexual in some manner. Once again, it is seen as not something that is natural, but there's a demand for cause. This was the central theme, sort of. It could be caused by mental illness. Schizoid personality disorder was one example that was given. It could be a psychological problem, like you have some sort of blockage that prevents you from forming this sexual attraction. It could be the result of autism or the inability to create and or maintain social relationships.
And it gets worse.
In the APA, the American Psychology Association, there's this diagnosis called HSDD, which stands for hypoactive sexual desire disorder. So there's this real diagnosis in this medical textbook that many Western healthcare professionals base their work upon. So there's a diagnosis that they have to take into consideration when facing someone who claims to be asexual or describes something that they understand as being asexuality. So this is not only a narrative, this is not only a discourse, it is also very much a real thing in medical textbooks. That once again explains why you are asexual and in that way invalidates it as a sexual orientation and claims it to be something else.
So she had made all of these findings and divided them into these categories.
My next question then, when I found these categories, is to say something about what could that mean, or what could I make out of that? Invalidation and the demand for there being a cause for your asexuality tells us something about what is seen as natural or unnatural. And it tells us that asexuality is not seen within this discourse as something being natural. It is rather seen as something deviant. Something has caused you to be asexual. Something has stirred your natural way of being and put you in a deviant position. And that is very interesting to me. What is this rule that asexuality evidently breaks against? What is this rule about natural sexuality that ace people break by being themselves? For a very long time, I had sort of a working title for this, and I called it the sexual imperative. But I had the huge luck to come across 4 scientific articles at a far higher scientific level than what I am about. These articles were trying to pitch the idea, or sort of a term or a theory, called compulsory sexuality. And as I read about compulsory sexuality, I found that this was describing the exact same thing as I was describing using my working title, the sexual imperative. So I compared their definition to my definition and then used compulsory sexuality as a theory and as a concept in my thesis. And this then came to be the sort of big find, more or less.
So now Alice was trying to break down the meaning of compulsory sexuality. And through her interviews, she found 3 rules for the concept compulsory sexuality.
The first rule of compulsory sexuality is the rule about being allosexual. Allosexuality means that you have a sexual orientation, you experience sexual attraction towards someone, a group of people, an object, yada yada. In our society, there's this interest in having everyone to conform and to become allosexual. This is a quote from someone who went to conversion therapy for their asexuality. The therapy program that they had to go through was sort of where they had to look at sexual images, and then they tried to sort of get them to think positive around these pictures. We're going to teach you how to be sexually attracted to some sex. So this person went through conversion therapy where they had to view images, sexual images, and then reprogram themselves to become sexually attracted to these situations and the sex opposite of their own. And this tells us that our society and our national care system is so interested in having you conform to compulsory sexuality that they are willing to provide you healthcare, conversion therapy in healthcare, to conform to allosexuality. The second rule of compulsory sexuality is the rule of having a sexual practice. You in some way practice sexual behavior with yourself, with others, something, whatever. Not all asexuals per definition break this rule, but even if they don't break this rule, there's a presumption that they might or that they do. And this assumption that every person that is healthy has a sexual practice with themselves and or others became super evident throughout every interview I had. One example is that when they sought healthcare for anything, it didn't have to do with their orientation or them seeking aid relating to their asexuality even. It could be just anything. The healthcare providers would want to test them for STDs and have them go through pregnancy tests, no matter how fiercely they stated that I am not sexually active. This is something that the healthcare professionals wouldn't accept. It wasn't in their world that could not be an option for you. And this is a very real thing for many asexuals, that you don't have a sexual practice with yourself or others. Not everyone, some. And this once again shows a very clear view of what is natural sexuality in our society. Someone who has a sexual practice. I have another quote on that, which is, I remember when I went to see my gynecologist, and it was just before I moved to country name. And that was amazing news to my gynecologist, because she was very upset that I was still a virgin. And she was like, oh, but you're moving to country name. This country is well known for handsome men, so you will find yourself a handsome man from this nationality. And next time I see you, it will be better. And this shows very clearly that it would be better for the person, the asexual person, if they were sexually active. And the gynecologist is so rooting for my interviewee to become sexually active with someone else. That would be better. You would be more normal. You would conform to compulsory sexuality. The third rule of compulsory sexuality is the norm of having a libido, preferably a quite strong libido as well. And once again, most asexuals break this rule per definition, but most are assumed to not have a libido or have a deficient libido. And the requirement to have a preferably strong libido was evident throughout every interview I had, especially according to them, since a misconception of asexuality is that it is related to your libido. And that is not in the definition. Some asexuals experience that it affects their libido, some don't. It is not in the definition. And whether you have a strong, weak, existing, non-existing libido doesn't, per definition, has anything to do with your asexuality. But since asexuals, in many cases, are presumed to have a deficient libido, it became evident that they break this rule. Even if they don't break the rule, they're assumed to break the rule of not having a normal libido.
And this is what she understood by finding and defining the concept compulsory sexuality.
This is understood to be the core of human sexuality. And if you deviate, you're seen as less than human. You have deviated from a natural way of being. You have deviated from normal sexuality. So compulsory sexuality is seen as being something that is healthy. It is good for you. It is natural. It's a normal way of being. Not only in relation to your sexual being, it also relates to every other aspect of life. If you conform to this, you're assumed to also be able to have a happy life in all other areas. And when you don't conform, you're assumed to not be happy in other areas of life as well.
And once again, how does this relate to medicalization?
Medicalization of asexuality gives legitimacy to compulsory sexuality. That is one of my big findings. By trying to get a grasp of what is normal, what is natural, a lot of things suddenly exist outside. So compulsory sexuality is this rule that pushes asexuality outside of the norm and makes it an object for medicalization. It enables the medicalization of asexuality to have this norm of what is healthy and what is natural. Within this discourse of the medicalization of asexuality, aceness doesn't fit in within natural variety of human sexuality. Because we all agree, more or less, that human sexual life has variations. It's a spectrum. You can be in many different ways and still be normal and natural. But within this discourse, asexuality doesn't fit in within this variety. Even though we admit that there is variety, asexuality still stands outside. It doesn't fit in.
And she hopes that more people will research asexuality.
I also hope that my research has made clear the huge research gap there is on asexuality, and I hope that many more people will research these things and that asexuality will not be something that is left out of academic worlds, rather seen as something that can help us understand how we view ourselves and how we view natural ways of human sexuality and a way of questioning our views on that.
And this is what that type of research could lead to.
Further research on asexuality and further acknowledgement of the concept of compulsory sexuality could help uproot this obsession with categorization of what is natural and what is unnatural. And it could be a strong force against medicalizing processes. And it could really help us include rather than to exclude. What actually is a variety of ways of being a human, sexual, non-sexual, asexual, blah, 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 everything. And I think that that sort of criticism against our way of viewing ourselves and obsession with defining ourselves as normal, not normal, or deviant, or whatever, is something that is not only good for us, but necessary for us to understand ourselves in a more nuanced way.
If you enjoyed watching that video, please like, comment, subscribe, and share the video. I really appreciate you showing your love in that way. If you also want to support the channel financially, that's possible via Patreon, but really no pressure. See you next time!